Hey everyone, it's Robert, and I just wanted to spend a few moments going over the PowerSchool PowerTeacher Pro Gradebook overview, so we can take a look at that and see what that looks like. Um, when I'm explaining this to clients, I really like to always just start out with that. What we are attempting to accomplish is to get two very large systems to communicate with one another. We're talking, of course, about the PowerTeacher Pro system and the Schoology system. The grade passback itself is a one-way grade passback, so that means it's going to take it from Schoology and pass it over to PowerTeacher Pro at the assignment level. That means it's not going to send over a total calculated score or anything like that. It's going to send it over on an assignment level and send it over there. So if you're looking at my screen here, we have Schoology open at the Robert King Academy. This is an example course that is we're going to be using here for Mr. Abram. This is his U.S. History Section 5 course. And this teacher actually has already set up their gradebook in PowerTeacher Pro, which they have here. You'll notice they've taken some assignments here in Schoology, or I'm sorry, in PowerTeacher Pro, but they're going to be using the grade passback from here on out. So what we recommend to clients is that once the teachers start using the grade passback functionality, is that they really take their grades from Schoology. It's a good idea to note that if they need to make modifications to those assignments, that they're actually doing those from Schoology. They're not going over to PowerTeacher Pro to edit those because Schoology is either going to try to overwrite what they've just edited or it could give an error. So always a really good idea to, once we make an assignment in Schoology and we pass that back over to PowerTeacher Pro, that we edit it from Schoology. So the first thing the teacher needs to do when they're set up is they need to make sure that the PowerSchool app is installed right over here on the left-hand side. This is going to be something that is installed by their system administrators. So it's a course level app from the App Center, similar to if they're doing PowerSchool provisioning. And it's worth noting here that courses that can be that we use the PowerTeacher Pro grade passback with have to come from PowerSchool. These can't be courses that the teacher has created themselves. It's absolutely a best practice that these courses have to come from PowerSchool. And what we're going to do from there is that the teacher is just going to go over to the grade. Actually, we're going to start out in their grade setup. So this would be the grade book for the teacher in Schoology. And we'll see that we have our grading periods and we don't have any categories or anything like that. Something to keep in mind here that I mentioned earlier is that the grade passback is at the assignment level. And so it's actually not going to be taken into account any grading periods or anything like that. We'll talk about more what it actually includes when we do the passback in a few minutes. The things that we want to make sure that teachers know is that first off, their gradebooks we really encourage them to look similar as they do in PowerTeacher Pro. So what does that mean? Well, that means that if they're using categories to weight in PowerTeacher Pro, that they're using categories to weight in Schoology. They don't necessarily absolutely have to, but it's best practice that they do that to make sure that those do start to look similar as best as possible. So just for an example here, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to set up a couple categories here in Schoology as Mr. Abram. I'm going to make a homework one. And the calculation method that you'll see here. Total points, we want to leave it at total points because the PowerTeacher Pro grade passback does calculate back as points. So we should definitely keep the calculation method as total points. We also want to make sure that we look at the drop lowest and we take that into account. So this would be, for instance, if I taught, for homework, I dropped the lowest 2 assignments. We want to make sure whatever that I'm doing in PowerTeacher Pro that I'm also doing in Schoology and that those do match the same. So we'll go ahead and create this category. I'll make another one. We'll make this one, let's say like classwork. Again, total points. And I'll even make a assessments one. So one thing to note here, just in case we haven't figured it out, is that we obviously have our categories set up within PowerTeacher Pro. We're going to want to make those in Schoology. Those categories are not going to pass from PowerTeacher Pro into Schoology. They're going to need to be made in both places for right now. And we can adjust the weightings, of course, here from the grade setup just by checking that weight grades. And we can change these to what we want. Maybe assessments. I'm pretty big on assessments. Going to be 40%. Classwork's going to be 30%, and we'll say homework is worth 30 as well. And I'm just changing those weights so they correspond with their percentages. So those are set up. Assessments, classwork, and homework are set up here. And then we're going to go down here and just take a look. Now, I mentioned that the assignments are being sent over individually. So the gradebook scale, if we have one that our district is wanting us to follow, we can definitely select that from here. So I have like a letter grade scale that I use here in mine. If we're rounding our grades, our final grades within PowerTeacher Pro, we would want to make sure that we round them within Schoology as well. And this is where we want to make sure that we pay attention to these two items right here, the visibility settings. What I do typically recommend to districts at the administrator level is that they do select the visibility settings for hide overall grade and student grade report and the hide and grading period grades and grade student grade report. What that's going to prevent the student from seeing is actually their term grade as well as their overall grade here in Schoology. And that's something that the district really needs to make sure that they have a conversation on is where are parents and students going to go to see the grade of record for a student? We tend to say that they should be looking in the SIS if they're using the grade passback because that's going to be the authoritative grade. And what this does is this actually prevents the student from looking in Schoology for a total calculated grade. That way, if there's any sort of discrepancy or anything like that, we're relying on the SIS. We're relying on PowerSchool to say this is your grade. This also is going to, by selecting these options, is going to make it to where if there are any weighting differences or anything like that, it's not going to necessarily matter because everything's going to be calculated over in PowerTeacher Pro. So I'm going to go ahead and select those boxes. I'm going to hit Save Changes. So there's three things we need to do to incorporate the grade passback. The first of which is make sure our Schoology gradebook is set up, which we've definitely done that. The next thing we need to do is configure our PowerTeacher Pro app within Schoology, this PowerSchool app. So I'm going to go over here and do that and select PowerSchool. You'll see it's loading. And we'll start off in the configuration tab. The first time that the teacher loads it, it is going to load the configuration tab there for them. Give it just a second to load. All right. Okay, and so here's what we see right now. We see our PowerSchool categories that it has pulled from PowerSchool. So this is what it finds for this teacher in their PowerTeacher Pro gradebook. This says these are the categories that you have. How do you want to map these to the ones in Schoology? So they don't have to match verbatim. You may notice that we made an assessment category. We didn't make a test or a quiz. And what I can do is I can say, well, okay, classwork. Well, these are the categories I made in Schoology. Classwork corresponds to classwork. I don't really do group projects, so I'm not going to pick that one. Homework to homework. I do class. Yeah, I'm not going to do project and test quiz. So what I could say in this instance is that, okay, well, I prefer to use test, and I'm going to click assessment. So for these three categories that I use, they will map over to these categories in PowerSchool. Categories are super important. They're the avenue in which those assignments are going to pass back. So we want to make sure that we definitely put those assignments in categories that are mapped to PowerTeacher Pro. That is one of the main troubleshooting tips that we see is that a teacher is putting something either in no category or they're putting it in a category that is not mapped. So super important that they do that. Another thing to keep in mind is here in PowerSchool, another thing to keep in mind is that PowerSchool does limit the number of characters that an assignment can take is for 50 characters. So if an assignment title is more than 50 characters, it will actually error out in the grade passback. So what we have it right here is an automatically shortened assignment title. We recommend that the teacher does select that. By selecting that, any assignment that comes over that's more than 50 characters, it's going to truncate it at 50 characters. So we'll go ahead and hit Save Changes. So we've set up our gradebook in Schoology. We've set the configuration for our grade passback from the app. And now let's go ahead and enter some grades in to the gradebook. So I'm just going to go into my gradebook. I'm going to make some assignments. And I'm going to go over this and just see what's super important, because what we need to keep in mind is that when we're talking about grade passback with PowerTeacher Pro, Schoology is sending over really 6 bits of information. I believe it's 6 if I counted correctly. That's going to be the assignment name, the assignment description, the due date, the category, and it's also going to send back over if it's synced or unsynced. So name, test assignment, test description, due date. I'm actually going to change this to my PowerSchool is an old instance, so I'm just going to say like November 20th of last year. Make sure I pick a category that is going over, so we'll say classwork. Going back to what I said is synced over, I forgot to talk about the points. So we have the name, the description, the due date, the category, if it's published or unpublished, and also the points possible and points earned by the student. So the earned points over the total points is what is sent over to PowerTeacher Pro. So we'll go ahead and say this is worth 10 points. And you'll notice an error I have here. They wouldn't normally see this. Again, I'm syncing to a grading period in PowerTeacher Pro that is last year. If you look at this is last school year. That's why I'm doing it. So they won't see this error because they're going to be picking a current due date and within a current grading period. They're also going to notice the sync to sys button that they have here. So this is the option for the teacher to say, no, I don't necessarily want to sync this item over to PowerTeacher Pro. I just want it to live in Schoology. Super important with those visibility settings that we do select those, especially in this instance, because if a teacher does deselect an item from syncing, it's going to still calculate in the Schoology gradebook, but it's never going to see the PowerTeacher Pro gradebook. So hiding those two items we talked about earlier in grade setup for visibility settings, super important if we want to try to leverage this. If we're using a grading scale, completely appropriate to put that in here. Again, we're not passing that back over into PowerTeacher Pro, but we can do that here. And then I mentioned published versus unpublished. Now, I want to show you what this means. So if I click this will be unpublished to students. And if I click it, it'll be published. That behavior is actually sent over to PowerTeacher Pro. And we'll take a look at that in just a second. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this create button. And here's my point values. I'm going to go ahead and put some point values in for the students because they've done a great job, yada, yada. Oh, Katie, you didn't do a good job. Oh, I gave you a, there we go. Cool. So you'll see here that we do have our assignments put in. I can also sync over a couple of other things. I can sync over the comments for an individual assignment. Great job. And this will pass back over to PowerTeacher Pro as well. One thing to note, if you notice in Schoology, we have the ability to not display this to students. So if we check this box, it will show up for students. If we don't select it, it won't show up for students. That is actually disregarded in the grade passback. So anything that you put in this grade comment will pass back over to PowerTeacher Pro. So we strongly encourage that if you're making any comments and you're using the passback functionality, make sure it's appropriate, of course, for parents and students to see. And the other thing we want to talk about is the exception codes. So if you click over here, this flag, you'll notice that we do have some exception codes over here. These do pass over into PowerTeacher Pro, but they do pass back over a little bit differently than you might want to expect. So an excused is just going to pass back over a blank grade to PowerTeacher Pro because blank grades don't actually penalize you in PowerTeacher Pro. An incomplete is going to show over as a, let me double check. Incomplete is going to pass back as a blank cell as well, again, not penalizing the student. A missing is going to pass back as a 0 to the student. So we want to make sure that if a teacher is using that, it is actually going to send back over to a 0 because that is a grade for the student. And I'm finding all of this information actually from our help center. So if you go actually to this wonderful help article we have out here for how to use exception codes in my gradebook, and I just scroll all the way down here, there is a nice chart we have here for excused, incomplete, and missing, how those behaviors are submitted. And also we have a great help article of everything we're going over today, syncing grades in the PowerTeacher Pro app. We have that located right here. All right, so we put those in here, and I'm just gonna go ahead and give these all to my students. Yeah, that's good. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. There are a few different ways to sync our grades. They are initiated by the teacher, so the teacher does need to actually sync the grades from their gradebook in order to send it over to PowerTeacher Pro. And the way they can do that is right over here in the upper right-hand corner. They should have this button that says Sync Changes to PowerSchool and View Sync Status Logs. So they can do that from here. Or they can also go back over to the app and do it. So I'll show you what it looks like if you click the app. You'll see that the sync grades and you'll see the test assignment. It has not synced yet. And I get the option to either sync changes, which will sync all of the assignments I have here that have had changes within Schoology over to PowerTeacher Pro. Or I can also go over and click this button, which would actually sync the individual assignment. It is worth noting that unless there are changes that are made to the assignment in Schoology, or maybe something has been altered like the student's grade, it's not going to perpetually sync that item every time they hit sync. It's only going to sync new items or in items that have been changed if we hit the sync changes. So again, we could hit either of these buttons, the individual assignment or all assignments. Another way, which I think is the more favored way if you go back to the gradebook, is that you can see those buttons up here. We'll go ahead and hit sync changes to PowerSchool. And the way I can see if that's behaving right now is I can click this clipboard status log. It is worth noting, once I hit that sync button, I don't have to stay on the screen. I can go and walk away, that's fine. As long as it's queued, it's good to go. And if I click that status log, you'll see indeed this assignment is queued, meaning it is being sent over to PowerTeacher Pro. We're either going to get back a successful message or an error message if we've made a mistake. And if we do get an error message, it would tell us right over here what that error is. So we'll give it just a second to see what that looks like. Okay, so we have just waited a couple moments and it was successful here. Something to note again is that we don't necessarily have to wait on the screen if we don't want to. It will still continue to sync, and that these do sync in fairly rare time. It's not completely instant. If they have several assignments they need to sync, that we do recommend that, they do give it a little bit of time to do that. One thing that I always point out to my schools as well is that it's always a great practice to set a cadence for your syncing. Maybe it's after every assignment, maybe it's after, at the end of the week or at the beginning of the week. Just finding a regular cadence will help you, because what you don't want to do is wait till the end of the semester, attempt to sync, and maybe you have forgot something along the process. Maybe you haven't been putting, categories. Maybe you haven't been putting due dates. Due dates are required for PowerTeacher Pro. If you don't put a due date on PowerTeacher Pro, it'll actually sync to the last day of the grading period. So maybe they're running into some issues with that. And if they're syncing regularly and they're checking those status logs, they're definitely going to be more successful. So what does that necessarily look like in PowerTeacher Pro? Well, I'm going to open that up and show that to you. This is my PowerTeacher Pro for this assignment. Again, they have been using it previously before Schoology, but I'm just going to refresh here and see if I can find that test assignment. Oh, there it is right there, test assignment. I'm going to open that up. And we'll see that I have my student grades as we had here. So I'll see that comment that we brought over. Oh, that's a bad zoom in. You'll see over here on the right-hand side in PowerTeacher Pro, great job, and have all these assignments that come over. So a really, really great resource. Now, one thing that I want to bring over to you is that we do get some questions about the published versus unpublished and what that actually looks like. And I think it's important to go over here. So we mentioned that within the passback, we send over the name, the description, the due date, the total points earned and the total points possible, the category, and then also if it's published versus unpublished. Now, what I mean by that published versus unpublished, that within PowerTeacher Pro, if you're looking at it, just to show you what it looks like, this little indicator right over here is the Publish tab. And what this allows it to do is that parents and students can see it right away. And that's how it's passed back if it is turned on, the Publish status within Schoology. Now, let's say, for instance, I change this. And let's say I unpublish it. So I'm going to unpublish it, save changes. And I'm actually going to, I made a change to the assignment. So if I hit the sync changes, it should sync. Let's see if it does. I hit that sync changes button and I go over to view sync status, and indeed it's queued once more. So we'll give it just a second to see what that behavior looks like in PowerTeacher Pro. All right, so that last sync was successful. So we're going to go back over to PowerTeacher Pro, and you'll see what I mean by the published status. I'm just going to refresh here really quickly. And we're going to go to that test assignment, and I'm just going to edit it once more to show you what I mean. You'll notice this triangle here, and what that means in PowerTeacher Pro language is that the item is not published. So by selecting that, the published assignment has been turned to never, and the published scores has been turned off. You'll notice here, and this is good to know in case they don't know this about PowerTeacher Pro, the assignment is still going to count in the final grade for the student, even if it is unpublished. Just students and parents won't be able to see it. That is something that they should know about PowerTeacher Pro, and that actually does behave the same in Schoology. If we unpublish the assignment, that's going to pass over into PowerTeacher Pro still. It just won't be visible to students and parents, but still, of course, visible to the teacher, as we can see here. So hopefully that this sync has been useful for you all. Hopefully it's beneficial in setting up this video. Again, things to keep in mind are super useful are on these Help Center pages, and then also I'm going to send you this sheet, if you don't already have it, our grade passback troubleshooting tips for eSchool Plus. Really great information in here talking about having a due date, making sure the categories are set up the same, rounding, weighted categories. One thing we didn't touch on is that when you make an item, it has a factor of 1.0. The teacher doesn't need to edit that because that actually information is not sent over to PowerSchool. If they weight it for something more or less, that's not going to be sent over to PowerTeacher Pro. And then, yeah, if they don't have anything if they don't have it in the right categories, it's not going to work. So hopefully useful for you all, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.
Robert, thank you so much for that overview. I think it's going to provide a lot of clarity for people who are a little nervous about this initial setup and changing the workflow slightly, like we talked about. When you're talking about a one-way sync, it's important to really conceptualize how you want your workflow to go. And to those ends, I've got some more specific questions from some of our users that I think might help us drill even further into some best practices. Yeah, so let's start at the top. Should I set up my categories first in PowerTeacher Pro or in Schoology?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Michael. If you think back to when we were talking about doing our grade setup, when we went to that PowerSchool app, it was reading our categories from PowerTeacher Pro. So because of that, we wanted to make sure that those are set up in PowerTeacher Pro first.
Okay. Then a question that comes up often is about linked sections. So if you've linked your sections in Schoology, how do you what things should you check off to make sure before you start syncing grades?
And you bring up a really good point, Michael. When we're talking about linked sections, and of course we can see the sections are linked over here at the top. So I got my US history and I've got section 2 and section 5 linked. When we're doing our setup from the PowerSchool course app, we're going to notice that we have our configurations that's loading right here. And you'll notice this toggle in the upper left-hand corner. This is where I can toggle between my different sections. It's good to keep in mind that these sections, although linked in Schoology, aren't necessarily linked over in PowerTeacher Pro. That's why they're remaining different. So if I go over and set my configurations up for, let's say, section 2, I can just easily toggle over to section 5 and set up my configurations there.
Okay, that makes sense. That's the setup. But then how does the sync work? Are they unified in any way during sync process, or do they sync them separately in each section?
Great question. So you're actually going to want to sync those individually as well. So going again to my grade book here, I see where I have section 2, just like I do in Schoology, where I can toggle between my different sections. I'll want to sync those individually. So if I click this, it's going to sync section 2. And if I just need to sync section 5, no worries. I just toggle over to section 5 and select that sync button once again.
Inside of Schoology, users might notice that after they've created categories, there's still an outstanding category that can be associated with some materials called ungraded. How does that affect my syncing process over into PowerTeacher Pro?
So yeah, absolutely. When you're talking about something that is not in a category, it's not going to be able to sync. Because think back to what we said earlier, where those categories are kind of like our highway between Schoology and PowerTeacher Pro. If it doesn't know which category to be in, then it doesn't know how to associate itself in PowerTeacher Pro. So one thing to keep in mind, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is you can always go over here to the upper right-hand corner, these 3 dots, and select the bulk edit screen. And the bulk edit screen is where you can see all of your assignments for a grading period, and you can see what category it's in. You can also see even the due dates over there. Just super, super useful.
So along those lines, let's say there are certain categories I want for just internal workflow of my course that I don't want to sync over.
Yeah.
Can I do that, and how so?
Absolutely. So again, I'm going to go back to that configuration screen we talked about earlier and just kind of show you this map. So notice over here, when we're looking at what we're syncing, on the right-hand side are our PowerSchool categories, and over here are my Schoology categories. So anything that's in homework, project, or test, I'm syncing over to PowerTeacher Pro. Well, if I don't want something synced over, I can just put it in any other category. And then if I do that, it's not going to be a part of that sync. Now, say for instance, Michael, I wanted something that was a part of a project or a homework or a test category, and I didn't want it to sync. It was still part of a category that usually syncs, but I don't want it to sync. That's where we're going to want to use that sync to sys button at the assignment level. So if I go over here and go back, let me just edit one of my assignments here. You'll notice this button right under here underneath the grading period, sync to sys. If I deselect that sync to sys button, what's going to happen is it's actually not going to attempt to sync. You'll notice in the status logs, it says it's opting out of the sync.
What if I have an assignment material type that does not have a due date and I sync that to PowerTeacher Pro? What happens in that event?
Oh, that's a good question. So the thing that happens is and we talked about how due dates are really important because that dictates what grading period it goes into in PowerTeacher Pro. But let's say you go rogue and you don't put a grading period or you don't put a due date in there. What's going to happen is it's going to sync to the last day of the grading period in PowerTeacher Pro. So let's say your semester ends on December 19th. If you synced it for sometime in August, you meant to do it in August, but you sync it, it's going to actually go over into that last day of that grading period. And that's important to know, Michael. We always talk about how due dates are important, but something to remember about PowerTeacher Pro is it doesn't like assignments with the same name and the same due date. So if I'm just calling everything homework and I'm giving it a different due date, it's fine with that. But if I start saying homework and they have the same due date, it's going to start giving us problems. So it's super important that we give things a due date to prevent it if we're using assignments that have the same name as well.
Okay, so then let's talk dates. Are the syncs based on grading period or the due date? I think you covered that, but.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're talking about is if I'm looking in an assignment, is it really paying attention to my due date over here, or is it paying attention to my grading period here? And the answer is it's paying attention to the due date. It's sending the due date over to PowerTeacher Pro and saying, put this assignment wherever it goes with this due date. And it's letting PowerTeacher determine, okay, this date is in which grading period. It's letting it do its magic over there. So the grading period is actually not paid attention to at all in the grade passback function.
What will happen in PowerTeacher Pro if I sync an item from Schoology that has a factor of 0 or something greater than 1?
Great question. So in Schoology, of course, you can put a different factor on an assignment. That is not part of the grade passback. So if you put 0.75, 0.5, or if you put 3.2 for whatever reason, that's actually not going to be a part of the grade passback. It's always going to sync over as a factor of 1. So if we're actually trying to make assignments worth more values, my recommendation is that we leverage our total points for that. So if it's an assignment that is, my homework's normally worth 10 points, but this one's really important. Instead of multiplying it by 2, let's make it worth 20 points. That way it's going to be weighted appropriately.
Okay, let's go on then. What happens if I change one student's grade in PowerTeacher Pro instead of the Schoology gradebook? Does it break the sync for all the other students in that assignment or just the student I made changes for?
Oh, that's a good point. Now, Michael, one of the fundamental things that we really talk about with this grade passback is that once we start passing back grades and we're using the Schoology gradebook and entering things there, we want to make any modifications from Schoology. The example you gave there, where maybe one of my students, Caden, he got a 19 out of 20, but he wanted to retake that and he wanted to get a 20 out of 20. So I'm going to go change his grade. I want to change that in Schoology as opposed to PowerTeacher Pro, because if I change it in PowerTeacher Pro, it may get overwritten by what's in Schoology, or it could cause an error.
Okay, so along the line of that, let's say things are working well, we've got our sync working, we don't want to break it. We do not want to break the sync. What are the red flags we want to look for to make sure we don't break that sync?
So the common culprits of a bad grade passback or some issues that teachers may face are going to be, maybe we don't have our categories correct. So I have my assignments in ungraded categories, or not in the category, or in the wrong category. That's probably the number one culprit for there, Michael. Not having a due date on there, another super important value. Maybe the teacher has unselected that sync to sys and they're wondering why it hasn't been synced over. One thing that I really think is important, and let's see if I can show you here. One thing to keep in mind here is that when we're in our gradebook, if we go over to this, we have our sync button, but right here, make sure we're paying attention to our sync status log. This is where we get a pulse check of how is our grade passback going. So for instance, in this one, I've got a lot of successes, but if I go over here and I select this view error, it'll give me a good idea as far as what the issue was. And in this case, I forgot a category.
Another question from a user: when making changes to an assignment in Schoology, how do I prevent duplicate assignments showing up in PowerSchool?
Yeah, so I guess, you shouldn't have different assignments showing over in PowerSchool, but if you are, a couple of ways that could be happening is that if maybe we were doing an assessment, and we know with assessments that if we indeed start to differentiate our assessments, it is going to show as separate assessments. So those are going to sync over in different columns over into PowerTeacher Pro. But as long as the assignments have a different name and a different due date for our everyday stuff, they should be coming over as an individual assignment over into PowerTeacher Pro. You shouldn't have to worry about duplicates.
Okay, so here are a couple of let's call them outlier type questions, but I think it's important to highlight since we're drilling in a little. So what happens in the event that I've already synced an item to my gradebook, and then I disable it by unchecking that sync assist option? What happens moving forward?
Yeah, so that item is completely excluded from future syncs. So if you were to do any sort of changes to that assignment, PowerTeacher Pro would not know about it. It is completely, it's like it's closing its ears to it. It's not going to listen to it at all. So for those cases, if you needed to actually, bring those changes back over into PowerTeacher Pro, we'd recommend re-enabling that sync.
Especially in the event like you talked about in your overview where we've hidden the grades from the Schoology view, making sure that there's a consistency between the two is pretty important, I suppose.
Yeah, so going back again, I know we talked about this earlier, but the reason we want to hide those visibility settings is so parents and students aren't getting frustrated or confused about seeing a total calculated grade in Schoology that's different from PowerTeacher Pro. Whereas, there might be items that you do in Schoology you don't necessarily want to send over to PowerTeacher Pro. Maybe it's like using Schoology, you're getting your students, used to using the platform, or it's just something different. In that instance, if you deselect that sync to sys button, it's still calculating in the Schoology gradebook. It's just not going to calculate in the PowerTeacher Pro gradebook. So hiding that visibility setting within Schoology, so everyone is looking at PowerTeacher Pro for their grade of record, is definitely going to protect us.
Okay, we've talked about red flags and some troubleshooting areas, places you can check. So what's the best way to check the status of a sync and see why something didn't sync? We talked a little bit about that. Will I get the same status and error messages if I sync from the PowerTeacher Pro app as I do from the Schoology gradebook area?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're talking about here, at least on my screen, is we have two ways to check our sync status. We can go back to the PowerSchool app over here. And we can see our sync status right here. So again, this is what we can see is successful. Maybe we have an error over here. But if we go to our gradebook, we can see this exact same screen over here from the clipboard. It is the same window. It's just actually a little bit more compact. So I'll just click that up here. Again, that clipboard right up here in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the same errors here. Absolutely. And you have the same buttons as well, Michael. So if you wanted to sync the changes from your gradebook, that would sync any changes in your Schoology gradebook. Or if you wanted to sync individual items, you could do that as well.
Okay, next we've got, this is a good question. What is the best way to deal with students that transfer from another course, another teacher's course, to my course in the middle of a grading period? Do I have to move them in PowerTeacher Pro or Schoology? What's the best way to roll?
Yeah, that's a good point. So if you're using PowerSchool provisioning, which if we're doing passback, we definitely are. The great thing is that when your administrators are changing student schedules, that's working on the back end. The PowerSchool system is telling Schoology all about that. So you don't necessarily have to about, let's say, Felicia over here. Well, we're just going to say bye, Felicia, and she's going to leave my class and she's going to move to another section. Well, I don't have to worry about actually moving her myself. The system is going to take care of that. But what we need to keep in mind is that the gradebook that is, that she's coming from, let's say she's going to another class, it might be entirely different than mine. So it's not fair to just say we're going to take over my assignments and drop them in another teacher's class. So we don't want to do that. What we can do to help that next teacher or for the next teacher to help me is to export our gradebook. So if I go over here to that three dots, again, where we had bulk edit, we can export our gradebook from here. And then we have a record of all of Felicia's assignments. Because what we need to keep in mind is once Felicia's gone from this gradebook, she's not going to show up here. We're not going to be able to see her assignments. Now, one thing that I'm just going to even follow up on here is, let's say I forget to do that. I forgot to export the gradebook and Felicia's out of my class. Are all those assignments gone? No, they're not. Don't worry. If we enroll Felicia back into my class, all those assignments will show back up. So what I can do as a teacher is I can actually just go to my members over here and I can add Felicia back into my class. If I add her back into my class, all of her grades are going to show up. And then I can either unenroll her manually, or if I just wait till tomorrow morning, the PowerSchool system is going to see that she's in there and it's going to pull her out anyways.
Okay. So let's talk about how we can give accurate grades without putting zeros in all of the missing assignment blocks when we're trying to wrap up grades at the end of a grading period or at the end of a year.
Okay, so what you're talking about for this case is that, say for instance, we have these exception codes over in Schoology. So again, that's if I go over here and I click this little icon, we have excused, incomplete, and missing. So these have different behaviors on how they interact with PowerTeacher Pro. So if I click excuse, it's going to send over to PowerSchool a null value, a blank value, because in PowerTeacher Pro, a blank value is not penalizing the student. It's just going to be blank. Incomplete is also going to send back a blank. And missing is actually going to send back a 0. So maybe my course policy is even if a student's missing something, I don't give zeros. I give them something else like that. Well, what I want to do in this case is I don't necessarily want to give them a missing because that's going to give them a 0. I could utilize another function. So keep in mind when we're syncing that this chat bubble right here, that's the comments section. That's where we can transfer comments over to the student. So let's say Joshua over here, I wanted to say missing assignment. If I send that over to them, or if I type that in, that's going to be sent over to PowerTeacher Pro. So maybe my policy is to not give a 0 out of 10, but maybe a 3 out of 10. That's the minimum he can get. I can definitely utilize that policy, and the message around it being missing is still sent over in the comments section of PowerTeacher Pro.
What happens when we're talking about the functionality in Schoology to individually assign assignments or graded materials to a specific student or a grading group of students? How does that work when we're talking about syncs? If they don't see a grade for things that are not assigned, will they see a grade for things that are not assigned to them inside of PowerTeacher Pro, and how can we alleviate that?
Yeah, so you bring up a really good point there. So what we need to keep in mind is within Schoology, let's say, for instance, I'm going to be differentiating my assignment. And let's say it's a standard, I was a math teacher, that I just need 3 or 4 of my students to, to redo. So what I can do here is, we know about grading groups. And if you don't know about grading groups, you should know about grading groups. Over here from the members screen, I can go to organize members into grading groups, and we'll just call these, the cool kids. And we're going to pick a couple of these students. I was poking fun at Felicia over there, so we'll put her in there. And you'll notice that they are now part of this grading group, and I can individually assign things to these students. So let's go over here and do that really quickly. All differentiated, right? There we go. We'll make this for 10 points. Give it a category. Categories are super important for maybe doing great pass back. And of course, the individual assigned here at the bottom. And I can type in cool kids. Now, back to the question that you asked, Michael. You said, how's this actually going to look in Schoology versus PowerTeacher Pro? So just like what we were talking about, if I have a differentiated assignment over here, these students that I'm able to enter grades for, it's going to show up in their grade book here in Schoology. But over in PowerTeacher Pro, everyone is going to see this assignment name. That's just because the whole assignment is passed back. We're not going to see any zeros for these students that are, exempt from it in Schoology. But what we just need to keep in mind is that, if we're going to be differentiating something, it might not be a bad idea to say, hey, maybe I don't necessarily sync this assignment. Maybe I'm going to include that in something else. I was a big math teacher on using stations. So you come into my classroom and I'd have 5 different stations, and students may do different ones. So what I would do is in my grade book, I would actually just probably have an assignment column that says stations for today, stations for Monday, and then put those assignments in for that. I wouldn't necessarily attach all of their work to the grade book, but just their actual credit for the day. But I still get that differentiation ability within Schoology.
What if I have a manual grade column, something you can do inside of Schoology for, let's say, a paper and pen test, or a behavior participation grade, something like that, where you'd create your own grading column in the gradebook. The question is, I want to sync that over to PowerTeacher Pro. Does that work? I know you don't generally put due dates on those, so how do we make it sync over if the due dates are so valuable?
So if I have a manual grading column, what I can actually do is use the bulk edit functionality to put in and edit those due dates. So again, that I talk about how that's probably one of the most magical things in Schoology is this bulk edit screen. If I go over there and click that, and then I will see a due date for any of my assignments that I have available to them.
That's great.
Yeah.
All right. So here's a final question. Final question for you. Thank you for your time today, by the way, Robert. Trust me, it's helpful. When an assignment is marked as missing, why does it not show up in the ungraded assignments shortcut when a student turns it in?
So if a student has and make sure I understand this correctly, if a student has something missing, that is a grade. So the teacher has gone in and they have said that this item is missing, that it is putting in a 0 for their grade. That is their grade. So that it's not necessarily saying that, I'm still looking for this assignment. Where is this assignment? The teacher has actually assessed that and said, no, this is missing. Give it this indication.
That goes back to the clarification of what each exemption code means inside of Schoology that you went over a
Exactly.
few minutes ago. All right,
Exactly.
so I guess I'll give you the final word here, Robert. Like, what your last three? This can seem a little overwhelming and/or complicated, but
Absolutely.
what are your like three top tips for an easy workflow when it comes to Grade Passback PowerTeacher Pro?
Absolutely. So with any new technology tool, you're going to run into road bumps or make mistakes, and that's okay. That sync status log is probably your best friend, and I seriously mean that, because the first couple of times you sync, you may be getting errors that you've forgotten categories, but after you do it enough, you're going to be great at it. So that goes into my second tip: is sync often. What you don't want to do is to have an entire semester's worth of grades, and then maybe again, December 19th, grades are due in PowerTeacher Pro. You go to sync all of those assignments on December 19th, and then you get a ton of errors and you're discouraged. No, what I recommend to my teachers is that, hey, minimum once a week, let's go in and sync those assignments. That way, if we're getting any errors or anything that we need to be aware of, maybe we need to change our workflow, that we can see it there. And then by the time we're at the end of the semester, everything's synced and we're definitely in a good place. The other thing that I want to make sure that you keep in mind is that those due dates are super, super important. Is we want to make sure that we have due dates. That way they're going over to the correct thing in Schoology. If we don't have those due dates, remember, PowerTeacher Pro is just going to throw it at the end of the grading period, and then we may wonder, where did that assignment go? So due dates are our best friend. The things that are sent over to, and just in case your teachers are wondering, and maybe you're like, what actually gets sent over? We have 6 things that are sent over in the PowerTeacher Pro. It may be 7 when I actually count them out. We have the name, the description, the total points possible, the total points earned, the category, the due date. Don't think I said due date. And then if the assignment is published or unpublished. So those things are sent over into PowerTeacher Pro. And it's good to know those things just so you can kind of figure out where things are going.
I think I speak on behalf of everybody, Robert. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm sure more questions will come up. Maybe we'll get another chance to talk about this. And in the meantime, I guess I would just say happy syncing and thanks to all the teachers out there for doing the work.
Absolutely, teachers. Thank you so much for paying attention to this. And we are always here to support you and help you out throughout your Schoology journey. Thanks so much, everyone.